In this presentation, I will be covering the WannaCry ransomware attack. So to begin, what is WannaCry? WannaCry is a ransomware crypto worm which targets machines running Windows operating system. WannaCry was used in a worldwide cyber attack May 2017. Worms are computer programs that copy themselves from one computer to other computers over a network automatically. Uh, they differ from viruses because they don't really need user input. Ransomware crypto worms encrypt data on the victim's computer and demand a ransom to decrypt the victim's data. One really important thing to remember is that if an attacker encrypts the victim's data and if the attacker receives a ransom to decrypt the data, the attacker is not really forced to decrypt the victim's data. Um, I really like this image right here because it gets at the heart of what a worm is. It's self-propagating. So, who made WannaCry? Who is responsible for making it? In late 2017, the U.S. government formally charged North Korea with developing the WannaCry worm, specifically a group called the Lazarus Group, which is a state-sponsored cyber attack believed to be based in North Korea. In addition, the UK came to the same conclusion. So, how did the US and UK governments know? Well, first of all, metadata in language files of the ransomware indicated computers that created the ransomware were set to UTC plus 9, which is the time zone used in North Korea. Also, the computer that created the language files for the ransomware had Hangul language fonts installed. Since Hangul is the written language of the Korean Peninsula, the conclusion that was quickly reached was that North Korea is responsible for the creation of WannaCry. So, what was the motivation behind North Korea developing WannaCry? When you see the ransomware, your first instinct is to believe that the motivation was purely monetary, that all the attackers really wanted to accomplish was just to gain money. While attackers did gain a sum of about $100,000 at the time, there might have been some political revenge North Korea wanted to exact on foreign countries. The year prior, North Korea carried out a successful nuclear weapons test, and this prompted many countries around the world to sanction North Korea to put pressure on North Korea to stop its nuclear testing program. Releasing this worm may have been a way for North Korea to hit back at countries that sanctioned them economically. So, what does WannaCry actually do? First, the worm scans for vulnerable systems, partly using OS fingerprinting. This is a tactic that we discussed in class. Then the worm uses the Eternal Blue exploit to gain access onto the vulnerable system. And we'll talk about what Eternal Blue is and what it does later in the presentation. Finally, the worm executes and runs itself on the vulnerable system. This image here is the screen you'll get on your device if you somehow were infected with the ransomware. One really big thing to notice here is that the ransomware demands Bitcoin as payment instead of cash. Basically, the way Bitcoin works, even though you can view the balances and transactions of the attacker's accounts, you can't really access who owns the account. And this protects the attacker's anonymity and makes it a bit harder to track attackers who use the ransomware. So, what is Eternal Blue? Eternal Blue is an exploit developed by the NSA for older Windows systems, which was stolen and leaked by a group called the Shadow Brokers at least a year prior to the attack. The stated purpose of the Shadow Brokers is to take down the NSA, and this was just one of their ways in trying to do so. The NSA held onto the Eternal Blue exploit without notifying Microsoft at least 5 years prior to the 2017 attack as part of its quote unquote offensive strategy. This basically means that exploits are stockpiled and they're going to be used on foreign agencies and organizations. All Windows versions prior to Windows 8 can run this exploit. These are the vulnerable systems that WannaCry scans for, and these versions of Windows contain something called an IPC share that allows a null session. This basically all it means is that a connection can be established to a remote system via anonymous login, so you can log into a system without a username or a password. Eternal Blue uses an attack exploit called buffer overflow. We talked about this in class. Buffer overflow occurs when more data is put into a fixed length buffer than a buffer can handle. And this image right here is a basic representation of what buffer overflow does. So this is how the Eternal Blue exploit works. And the version I'm going to give glosses over massive layers of technical complexity, by the way. Basically, it affects a protocol called SMB in older Windows systems to achieve remote code execution. SMB is a protocol in older Windows systems used to send files from one system to another. There is a major bug in that Eternal Blue uses to achieve remote code execution. The major bug is called the quote unquote wrong casting bug. So every file that you send has extended file attributes. And there's a bug in the process of converting extended file attributes from one format to another that can cause buffer overflow. So this right here is an SMB packet, which is used to send files in the SMB protocol. The only thing on this image you really need to know is the size of list and bytes right here. So to start, there are two formats of extended file attributes that we'll discuss here: OS2 and NT. OS2 formatted lists must be converted to NT format lists for SMB. And to accommodate the change, OS2 formatted lists are shrunk to the size of NT formatted lists. However, a problem occurs since the size of list in bytes, right here is a D word or double word size variable of OS2, but it's treated in NT as a word size variable. And that's where the bug comes in. A D word size variable is 32 bits in length, while a word size variable is only 16 bits in length. The function which updates the size of the list, will only update the two least significant bytes of the size of the list in bytes because it thinks that size of the list in bytes is a word size variable. Therefore, if the size of the list in bytes is greater than 2 to the 16, then the function will actually enlarge it accidentally. Since the size of the buffer reserved for an NT list is calculated correctly, this means that the NT buffer will be small as it should be, but the size of the list in bytes field will be massive. And this field right here is the amount of bytes that will be copied over into the buffer, which will obviously cause an out of bounds write. This image right here illustrates what happens when the size of the list in bytes is greater than 2 to the 16. So, what are the consequences of the WannaCry ransomware attack? Estimates put the cost of WannaCry at around $4 billion in damages. And even deeper loss is the loss of data and access for hospitals and healthcare institutions. When a network crashes at a hospital, doctors can't see information on, maybe surgeries that are meant to take place. And this reduces the trust the patient has on a hospital, not only to operate on patients, but to keep sensitive data. According to a report, the ransomware attack had shut down work at 16 hospitals across the UK after doctors got blocked from accessing patient files. This affected patients greatly, even leaving some ambulances to be rerouted to other hospitals unintentionally. And this affected patients' trust so much and affected hospitals that 19,000 appointments were canceled as a result of the WannaCry ransomware attack. So the response to WannaCry to update software was very, very slow. 2 years after the attack, there were still millions of vulnerable machines. In a survey in 2017 published 2 months after the attack, 87% said their organization wasn't accelerating Windows 10 deployment plans, despite 71% saying WannaCry led them to try and keep systems updated. 86% of respondents were unprepared for the attack, and this led to 70% having to put in weekend overtime to get caught up on missing security patches. So there are a couple of lessons that we can learn from WannaCry. The first is the principle of never trusting user input. If a file had extended file attributes that a user made super long, that would essentially enable the WannaCry exploitation. Even though some users had antivirus software, it proved really ineffective against a worm. And in an experiment made by a UK security research firm, only 3 out of 14 antivirus software packages managed to block WannaCry. Another lesson we can learn from WannaCry is that there kind of exists some sort of inequality of information across the globe. In the US, only 1,600 organizations were reported to have been affected, while 11,000 were reported to have been affected in Russia, and a similar amount in China. And this was mostly in part to software updates not being implemented abroad. So here are a few questions that are relevant to attack. Should government or agencies and non-corporate organizations have the responsibility of reporting flaws with software? And if so, what time frame should an organization have in reporting bugs? There exists a mutual distrust between the NSA and Microsoft now, and courts may have to step in the future to determine this question. The second question is, how can companies like Microsoft help individuals and companies here in America update their software? What about individuals and companies from other countries to update their software? And we'll stop here.